Hello and welcome to this online guided tour at the Dachau concentration camp memorial. My name is Raffaella Merlini, my colleague Luisa Ferrero is doing the filming, and my other colleague Maximilian Lukwerks is supporting us at the computer. Today we're going to talk about the barracks here at the concentration camp. They were in fact the living quarters of the prisoners and therefore played a central role in the daily life at the concentration camp. Please feel free to ask any question at any time. You can type your question in the chat and either Max will answer you directly or Luisa will read the question out to me. The first prisoners were brought here on the 22nd of March 1933, so very soon after Hitler had been appointed Chancellor on the 30th of January 1933. This camp will be the only camp to operate throughout the 12 years of the dictatorship, and in these 12 years over 200,000 prisoners will be brought here, and at least 41,556 of them will die here. The concentration camp was liberated on the 29th of April 1945 by two American divisions. And when the Americans arrived, there were about 32,000 prisoners here, although the capacity of the camp was about 6,500. In fact, the prisoners were in appalling conditions, in a catastrophic state of exhaustion, malnutrition, and overrun by diseases. In fact, here we see a photograph of the American military trying to cope with the many affected by typhus. It took time for the survivors to regain their strength and health in order to get back to their homes and also to find the means of transport for doing so. And this repatriation was coordinated by the International Committee of Prisoners that had been founded here in the weeks just before the liberation. Nowadays, we tend to take it for granted that next concentration camp should be transformed into a memorial, but this did not happen immediately. Only the crematorium area was seen as a place for remembrance as soon as the camp was liberated. The rest of the concentration camp was used by the Americans as a detention area for Nazi criminals. In fact, here, between July 1945 and the summer of 1948, 489 trials were held against Nazi criminals, and this is the inside of a courtroom which was set up in this building in front of us. And in summer 1948, the Americans give most of the area back to the local authorities, who then transform the camp in a refugee camp, where the refugees are German-speaking communities that had lived in Poland and Czechoslovakia. And the very presence of these German-speaking minorities had been used by the Nazis as a pretext for military intervention in 1938 and 1939. So, therefore, after the end of the Second World War, these communities are no longer welcome there, and they have to leave most of their possessions and come to Germany, but most of them had never ever lived in Germany. Plus, Germany had been bombed quite a bit, so there were no empty buildings to give these thousands of families. So the authorities decide to use the empty barracks as a shelter for the refugees. But of course, it's no longer a prison, so they pull down the barbed wire, they refurbish the barracks and turn them into apartments for prisoners. Here we see a photograph of a little boy playing next to where there used to be the camp wall, and you can see that there are still the poles that had supported the electrified barbed wire. the camp is changed very much. They set up a school, open shops, as we can see in this postcard of the 1950s, presenting the camp as actually residential area of East Dachau. And you can see also a church had been built and there are shops inside the camp. Yet this is still a very sort of temporary kind of accommodation, and the refugees will gradually move out of the camp, of the refugee camp, and to a more permanent residence. And by the early 1960s, most of the prisoners, the refugees have left, so the International Committee of the Survivors can turn the area into a memorial. But they realized that the barracks that were standing at the time were falling to bits and also had been very much transformed and didn't have much in common with the barracks where they themselves had lived. So they decided to pull them all down, and demolition took place in November 1964. And they also decide to reconstruct 2 barracks to show visitors, to give them an idea of what the barracks looked like at the time. Okay, sorry about this. I thought there was a problem with the video. What is normally presented in a memorial is not always so obvious. It is subject to historical and pedagogical research and debate, and reconstruction is not normally the preferred option, but it is sometimes seen as an effective way of presenting living conditions. I also want to point out that everything that is presented here at the memorial has been approved by the Committee of the Survivors, which is still presided by a survivor. His name is Abba Naor. He was born in 1928 in Lithuania, and in 1941 he was deported together with his Jewish family to a ghetto in Kaunas. And from there he will have to face slave labor in several concentration camps, the last of which was Dachau, where he was deported to in 1944 at the age of 16. Now, inside one of the barracks, also some of the furniture has been reconstructed, so we can go inside and take a look. This first room that we see here represents the dorm of the first phase of the concentration camp. We said that Dachau was one of the first concentration camps to be set up, and the other initial concentration camps had been more makeshift, more temporary concentration camps, whereas this was the first structured concentration camp. And the reason why the SS decide to use this location is because here, during the First World War, there had been a gunpowder and munition factory which had been shut down as a consequence of the Treaty of Versailles, by which Germany was obliged to disarm, therefore reduce its army to a minimum and stop any military production. So the 8,000 workers that had been working here were dismissed, and the area was abandoned for several years. But for the SS it was suitable for a concentration camp, since it was located outside the small town of Dachau, which was close to Munich, which was very active politically at the time, so a strategic position. Plus, there was a useful infrastructure like water pipes, sewage pipes, a railway line, the workshop where production had taken place, and also the 10 stone barracks where the workers had had their living quarters. So the SS decide to use these 10 stone barracks and turn them into dormitories for prisoners. They had concrete floors and were not heated. And in each barrack, there would be 5 dorms of this kind, where there would be a sleeping area designed for 54 men, and also a sort of day area. So the only area where you had any privacy would be your own bed, where there was also a shelf for personal possessions like glasses or soap. Each bed had a straw mattress, a pillow, and a blanket. Prisoners did not eat inside the barrack in the first stage of a concentration camp. They would go and have their meals in the camp mess, which was located in a separate building. Food did not taste nice, but in the pre-war phase was sufficient to survive on. Also, some prisoners would be allowed to receive money that they could spend in a camp canteen to buy bread or dried meat, but at extremely high prices. So we can say that in the pre-war phase, material conditions were tolerable, but what made life unbearable in the concentration camp were the working conditions and also, and especially, the arbitrary cruelty of the SS. And the prisoners in this pre-war phase are all German, mainly political opponents, although other groups will be targeted, like Jehovah's Witnesses, Sinti and Roma, homosexuals, and people who were considered deviant, unfit to be part of society by the Nazis. The number of Jewish prisoners in the first phase, in the pre-war phase, of the concentration camp is relatively small until November 1938. Jewish prisoners are not arrested explicitly for being Jewish. They'd normally be accused of being political opponents. But the Jewish prisoners who were brought here would be deliberately targeted by the excesses of the SS. So it would be much more probable that you'd be tormented to death by the SS if you were Jewish rather than if you were not Jewish. The years 1936 to 1938 are a sort of transition period. A first wave of political terror is slowly dying out, but a new phase, even more brutal and extensive, is being organized together with the preparation for war. In fact, already in 1937, the SS order the prisoners to expand the camp. So they have to pull down the 10 stone barracks and build 34 wooden barracks without any foundations, there would be 30 barracks that were used as dormitories for the prisoners, and each one of these there would be 4 dorms like this one here. And you can see that the bed is narrower than in the previous dorm, and there's less of a separation between the beds, and there's no more this shelf for personal possessions. In fact, the capacity of the concentration camp has increased from 2,700 to 6,240. The SS tormented the prisoners with obsessive military discipline, which started already early in the morning. Here we have Jean Bernard, who was a Catholic priest from Luxembourg and a prisoner here in 1941 and 1942. And he will write, make the beds, oh, what dreadful words, reflecting the stupidity of the cruel discipline of a camp. A straw sack is naturally round, so no, of course, it has to have corners, like a cigar box. I'm stunned with amazement as my roommates go about making the beds. Planks and little boards appear out of hiding places. They had been especially carved for this purpose. Then Jean Bernard goes on into a long and detailed description because making the beds was very complicated here. Everything had to be geometrically aligned across the rows, and according up also the tiers had to be perfectly aligned. So making the beds was a real science in the concentration camp, and any imperfection in this science would be severely punished. Sometimes the individual would be punished, sometimes the whole dorm. Also in 1937 and 1938, the striped uniforms are introduced in the concentration camp, as my colleague Thomas Wagner explained in his online guided tour on the uniforms a few weeks ago. Prisoners also had to sew the number and the category they'd been assigned to, the symbol of the category they'd been assigned to on their uniforms, because the SS divided prisoners in different categories and treated the categories differently as a way of breaking down solidarity, of making one group hostile, jealous of another group. They also had a complex system of bureaucracy and hierarchy, and some prisoners would be given special functions. They would be appointed head of a dorm, sort of dorm elder, and so they were responsible for the dorm being kept clean and tidy, or they were made head of a work detail, and so they were responsible for the work that was to be done in the work detail. And this responsibility was paid with better food and better clothes, which of course meant a higher chance of surviving. So unfortunately, many of these prisoners with special functions that were called capos and had an armband on their sleeve will turn just as brutal as the SS. And survivors will later recall that the brutality of their fellow prisoners, of the capos, was even more depressing than the brutality of the SS. In fact, here we have Giovanni Melodia, who was an Italian journalist, an anti-fascist, who had already spent 4 years in Italian prison before being deported here to Dachau in October 1943. And he will write, the concentration camp soon taught us one thing, the most depressing thing of all, that there is practically no one who does not have the instinct of the executioner. All you need is a bit of authority and impunity combined with the smallest hope of surviving, and the arm is ready to be raised and to strike the blow. But not all prisoners were brutal, not all capos were brutal. Some of them actually used their position to try and help fellow prisoners. One of them was Karl Wagner, who was a communist and therefore an opponent of the regime from the very start. And he will be arrested several times. And as from 1936, he is a prisoner here in Dachau. He had building construction experience and also leadership abilities. So he will be made capo of the construction detail. But he tried to motivate the prisoners who were under his command. He was not brutal, and he actually tried to always get better food rations for the people under his command. So he was very much respected among all prisoners. And in 1943, he will be ordered to flog a young Ukrainian prisoner who had been accused of sabotage. This prisoner was called Nikolai Koprenko and had been deported from the Ukraine at the age of 18 and brought to Germany to work as a slave laborer. Karl Wagner will refuse to flog Koprenko. He says, Ich schlage nicht, I do not hit. And he continues to refuse, he goes on refusing to flog Koprenko even when the SS repeat the order, pointing a gun at him. Luckily, and maybe surprisingly, he does not get shot. But of course, he does get punished. He's beaten up, removed from he's deprived of his function, and also locked up in a dark cell in the camp prison for many weeks. But Karl Wagner did survive, and he was able to tell his son about his experience in the concentration camp. And 5 years ago, during the 70th celebration for the anniversary of the liberation of the concentration camp of Dachau, Karl Wagner's son was here, and he was talking about this incident, and one of the survivors present was actually Nikolai Koprenko himself, who had also survived the camp and had moved to the States and changed his name to Nick Hope. Nick Hope and the son of Karl Wagner were very glad to be able to meet. Now, each dorm also had a day area which is reproduced in this room, and you can see that there were the military, narrow military lockers, and also tables and stools, because now prisoners have to have their meals inside the barracks. But the SS tormented the prisoners also with obsessive cleaning, so meals had to be swallowed quickly, and then these stools had to be put up on top of the lockers. All the cutlery and plates and cups had to be polished and put away inside the lockers, as you can see in this photograph here, which Louisa will show you in a couple of minutes. And all the prisoners had to leave the barrack, and only the prisoners on cleaning duty will remain inside and go through a very intensive cleaning session 3 times a day. All the windows had to be washed, everything had to be dusted and polished, and particularly the floor had to be polished intensively for a long time, at least twice, so that it would become super shiny, as you can see in this propaganda photograph. The invasion of Poland and the breakout of the Second World War will have a direct impact on the concentration camps, because the Nazis will use the state of war to get rid of all the administrative and legal rules that had put restraint on the authority of the SS on the prisoners in the concentration camp. We know it was a very slight restraint, but now there is none at all, because as from the 17th of October 1939, the SS acquire legal jurisdiction here over the concentration camps, and so they can decide even more freely who's going to live and who's going to die here. The prisoner becomes a mere piece of property. And we could say that, to a certain extent, the slavery inside the concentration camps is even worse than the typical kind of slavery, because the aim of the SS was to achieve maximum death. The labor of the prisoners is just a byproduct. In fact, they oblige prisoners to work at an unbearable pace by beating them and with extreme brutality, and also they have reduced them to starvation rations. So prisoners rapidly deteriorate physically and sometimes mentally, and so many of them perish. Also, the public hangings for sabotage become quite frequent, so the death rate increases enormously. But in the first years of the war, the Nazis were at the height of their glory because they managed to invade several countries, one after the others, often in the space of a few weeks, and they deport many people from these invaded territories and bring them to the concentration camps, particularly in Eastern Europe. Repression will be even harsher than in countries invaded in Western Europe, because there was sort of racism even towards Eastern Europeans. So the repression was extremely harsh, and so the number of people arriving here from Eastern Europe is enormous. And in spite of the increased death rate in the concentration camp is always overcrowded. Here we have Boris Kobe, who was a Slovenian painter and architect, and he was part of a resistance and was brought to Dachau in 1943. After liberation, he will make a set of playing cards in which he depicts the daily life of a prisoner in the concentration camp, and in this card he gives a very sort of effective image of the overcrowded bunk beds inside the barracks. The community here has also become more international, and we have another prisoner who was called Aleksandar Sameechnik. He was a young boy who had been part of a Czech resistance and was arrested at the age of 17 and then brought here to Dachau, and he will survive the camp and become a historian, and his contribution towards the history of the concentration of Dachau is very precious to us. He wrote that prisoners sometimes would come across friends or acquaintances they had known in their own country, but it was difficult to recognize them because now they were emaciated, grey, and looked strange in striped rags and shaved heads. Even their personality had changed. They had somehow different eyes, which reflected weariness and animal greed at the sight of a bit of food. Each prisoner was marked by the instinct of self-preservation, which led them to be hard, coarse, and ruthless. For Sameechnik, the only way to survive was to distance oneself mentally from the inhuman reality and try, even in the worst moments, to maintain a position of moral superiority over the men in jackboots and their puppets with the armbands. The invasion of one country after the other, though, comes to a halt when the Nazis try to invade the Soviet Union. Yes, is there a question?
If the barracks was used only for life or for some production or religious uses?
We will later we will go down the camp road and talk about the function of the various barracks. Now we're just going through the reconstruction of the furniture of a barrack that was used for living area, so sleeping and meals. Yes, we were saying that with the invasion of, we attempt to invade the Soviet Union. This time the Nazis do not have a blitzkrieg, a quick war, and their German army is halted by the Russian winter, but also by the extraordinary resistance of the Soviet army. So they discover that they're not invincible after all, and that they actually need the labor of the prisoners of a concentration camp, because now they realize that the war is going to be protracted, and so they need more weapons, more munition. So there's a demand towards the SS to increase the productivity of the prisoners inside the concentration camp. So a few improvements are introduced. More prisoners are allowed to receive food parcels from home, this time with no limit in quantity and weight. More prisoners are allowed to buy stuff in the camp canteen, although by this time there was practically nothing to buy, and the prices were still sky high. And also a few cultural events are organized, some films are projected, some prisoners are allowed to perform concerts or stage plays for their fellow prisoners, and the use of the camp library is expanded, and also some football matches are organized, although of course the number of prisoners who had the energy to play football were not that many. Also, they reduce the obsession with cleaning and slightly, and also they reduce the length of the roll call, standing at the roll call. So all this is an improvement, but at the same time the working hours are brought up to 11 hours per day. So in spite of the improvements, the camp is still overcrowded, so there are many diseases in the camp, and in December 1942, a typhus epidemic breaks out in the camp, and the SS will put up posters like this one that says, be careful, one louse your death, in several languages. And also prisoners will be inspected for lice every day by the dorm elders. The dorm elders will have to inspect the armpits and pubic hairs of the prisoners and also disinfect them. If a prisoner was caught with lice, he will be beaten up, dragged into the washroom. Cold buckets of water will be thrown at him, and he will be scrubbed until he bled. You can see here that the capos are no longer wearing striped uniform. That's because they had run out of material to make the uniforms with, so they had to use civilian clothes but marked with red paint so that they would still be recognizable as prisoners of a concentration camp. The only positive side of the typhus epidemic was that the SS were scared of getting the disease themselves, so for a time they were a bit less present inside the prisoners' camp, which meant a little more freedom for the prisoners. 2 dorms would have to share washrooms and toilets. You can see that it's there's no privacy, and also not enough for the minimum number of prisoners, which would be 104. But we also know that the camp was constantly overcrowded. And in fact, in this last room, we have the dorm of the last phase, as from 1944, where the prisoners where there's an extreme overcrowding, and in fact the bunk beds are still in 3 tiers, but this time there is no separation between the beds. They're just wooden planks where prisoners had to be crammed in like sardines. And in fact, in one of these dorms, instead of 52 men, there'll be sometimes up to 500 men. And of course, blankets or straw sacks have now become sheer luxury. We can now go outside the barrack again. And we can see that this reconstructed barrack reflects the barracks that were constructed in 1937, not the stone barracks of the first phase, and they used to be painted green. In the expansion phase of 1937-1938, also the main entrance to the prisoners' camp was built. And Luisa will show you in a few minutes the building, which had the offices of the guards, and also the gate with the inscription Arbeit macht frei, work sets you free. Still in this period of 1937-1938, the main building of a prisoners' camp was built, and it had the registration room, boiler room, shower room, and in the center there were the kitchens, and the rest were workshops. Now inside this main building there is the museum, and on the left side there are the offices and the archive of the memorial. Now we can go towards what used to be called the Lagerstrasse, the camp road. In fact, the barracks were constructed in 2 rows. And we were saying that 30 barracks were used as living quarters, as dormitories for prisoners, whereas the first 2 barracks on this side were supposed to be the infirmary for the prisoners, whereas on the other side, in the first barrack, there were the camp library, camp canteen, registry office, and a so-called anthropological museum, whereas on the barrack behind it, inside the barrack behind it, there were some workshops. The rest of the barracks were used as living quarters for the prisoners, and we said that now they have to have their meals inside the barracks. And also that food had now become insufficient. The prisoners had mainly a liquid diet, and so prisoners had to go and fetch this watery soup from the kitchens and bring it to their barracks. And they had to carry this watery soup in these metal cauldrons, which were very heavy even when empty, but with about 50 liters of food, they would weigh between 65 and 70 kilos. Plus they were hot and very difficult to carry, and the SS often obliged prisoners to run, holding these cauldrons, and they had been given wooden clogs, with which it was difficult to run even without carrying weights, let alone with such a heavy load. So if a prisoner tripped over and spilt the soup, he would be beaten up, sometimes even to death. So being further away from the camp kitchen was a disadvantage, because prisoners would have to carry the food for longer, it would get cold, more soup would be spilt, and prisoners would have less time to eat it in. So the distribution of the prisoners in the various barracks was done according to the camp hierarchy, which is now mainly based on nationality, because the Germans are a minority, and all foreign prisoners are automatically declared political prisoners. And this meant that Russians, Italians, and Eastern Europeans would be at the bottom of the hierarchy, and so at the back, whereas German, Austrian, French, Dutch, and prisoners from Luxembourg would normally be more up front. Jewish prisoners, whatever their nationality, would have been at the bottom of the category of the hierarchy, but as from 1939, most Jewish prisoners are deported from Germany to concentration camp in Eastern Europe, and many of them will perish in the Holocaust as starting from January 1942. But after the defeat of Stalingrad, the pressure, the demand for slave labor increases even more inside the concentration camps. So they will start bringing some Jewish prisoners to Germany. and also here to Dachau. But here to Dachau, Jewish prisoners would tended to be sent to the subsidiary camps. In fact, Dachau had about 170 subsidiary camps, some bigger, some smaller, and the Jewish prisoners would normally be sent to these subsidiary camps where living and working conditions were even worse than the conditions inside the main camp. We said that the first two barracks on this side had been designed to be the infirmary, the sick bay, but it will be expanded to 6 barracks, as we can see here, all connected with a corridor. And the doctors working in the infirmary were SS doctors, and some of them were very young doctors who had just been through a crash course in medicine and used the concentration camp as practicing grounds and a stepping stone for a better job. And there were doctors here who performed dreadful medical experiments on prisoners. Also, from 1941 to 1943, the SS doctors will perform selections here, where some prisoners who are seen as mentally ill or just not fit to work will be singled out for what the Nazis call invalid transports. This meant that these people would be transported, taken to a place in Austria called Schloss Hartheim, where they will be murdered in a gas chamber. The nursing staff was not trained staff. It was just prisoners randomly chosen by the SS. And some of them, unfortunately, again, will misuse their posts they've been given to. For instance, between 1938 and 1941, here there was an Austrian prisoner called Josef Haydn, who will be capo of the infirmary, who will be responsible for dreadful acts of brutality. He will terrorize the patients and even perform unnecessary medical operation himself, although he had no medical knowledge at all. But again, not all prisoners who worked in the infirmary were like this. In fact, Aleksandar Sameechnik, who we mentioned earlier, worked in the infirmary, and he will report that actually the infirmary was one of the hubs of solidarity. Patients from different countries lay side by side, and nursing staff from different countries worked side by side to relieve their suffering. It is no accident that the International Prisoners Committee had its origin in the Dachau infirmary. Despite the appalling conditions, this was the place where one could help and save lives. An example of this kind of commitment is given by Heinrich Stör. He was a socialist, so also an opponent to the regime from the start, and he was brought here in 1934, and as from 1940 he will be working in the infirmary, and he had no medical training at all, but he will use all the opportunities he can get to gain some medical knowledge. He even got medical books so that he could learn and be of better assistance to the patients. He saved many people by also falsifying documents in order for prisoners not to be taken away in the invalid transports. He will not report deaths so as to get more food rations for the patients, and also he will secretly give medication to the prisoners who'd been subjected to medical experiments. Among the many people he saved, there was the young Kazimir Majdansky, who had been subjected to medical experiments, and also Professor Karol Feierabend, who was the oldest prisoner here in Dachau. In fact, he was brought here from Czechoslovakia in 1942 at the age of 81. The medical staff will hide Karol Feierabend for 3 years in the infirmary so that he will actually be liberated by the Americans in 1945. Are there any more questions? No? Then I'd like to finish with a last quote from another prisoner who has meant a lot to us and to the memorial. His name is Nico Rost. He was a Dutch journalist and translator. He had moved to Berlin in the 1920s and had been arrested already in 1933 because he was a communist. So he'd been arrested by the Nazis, but he had been released. So he moved to Brussels. But when the Nazis invaded Belgium, he joined the Belgian resistance. Unfortunately, he was captured in 1943 and brought here to Dachau in 1944. And here he also worked in the infirmary, and he tried to get hold of any piece of paper he could find in order to keep a secret diary in which he also noted the prisoners who died day by day. And this is what he writes: "I have sworn to myself to do everything I can to let these dead come to life again later in everything that I will write. These dead must live so that the living who will come after them do not have to die. I want to stay alive to let them live again." Any more questions? No? Then I thank you very much for your attention, and should you have any feedback, please feel free to write to us, and also if you have any suggestions for future online guided tour. Thank you very much, and bye-bye.